Okay, hello sophomores. Mr. Ristow here. We're going to be talking about the effects of the New Deal in this video lecture. This video lecture corresponds to chapter 9.3 of your textbook, and that would correlate to pages 300 to approximately pages 309 of your textbook. All right, so this is chapter 9.3. Thus far, if you recall, we've taken a look at the causes of the Depression. We took a look at how the Depression was affecting people. We took a look at how the Hoover administration responded, and then the other day in class we took a look at how FDR's administration responded. And I mentioned that the biggest thing that you want to know, or one of the big things, is how or what was the difference, the biggest differences between how Hoover's presidency, his administration, responded and that of FDR's. So what we're taking a look at here in 9.3 are the effects of the New Deal, and what we mean by that is specifically we'll take a look at what kinds of groups were largely affected by the New Deal. Remember, the New Deal did not get the country out of the Great Depression, nor did it help all people. There were plenty of programs that did fail, plenty of groups of people who were not affected by the New Deal at all. It took World War II actually to get the Depression or get the country moving again out of the Depression. All right, so here we go. Some of the objectives that you want to know, things you want to know for the test coming up beginning of the week here. Make sure you know how the New Deal affected different groups of people. Like I just mentioned, you want to be able to explain how the New Deal changed the shape of American politics. And with that, I should also say you want to be able to explain and know how the New Deal affected the scope and the size of the government, the role of the federal government in people's lives. I mentioned that the other day in class. And also just have a general idea of what impact the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt had on America, right? So some vocab. You'll notice the vocab as you're going through part 3. All right, so our first question here, how did the New Deal change the landscape, the social, political, and economic landscape for people to come? Well, we know that the New Deal provided much needed relief from the Depression for many of people. It acted many reforms to try and guard against a catastrophe like this ever happening again. But it didn't, like I said, it did not end the Great Depression. World War II, with all of the massive military spending, would end finally the Great Depression. But the New Deal did change and had an impact socially, economically, and politically on the landscape in the United States. The New Deal affected many people from many different walks of life. It fundamentally changed the scope and the size of the federal government, and it changed the role of the government in people's lives. It changed with it the power of the presidency. The office of the president became much more powerful as a result of the New Deal. And frankly, it changed the relationship that people had with their government. Prior to the New Deal, prior to the Great Depression, many people did not know or understand the role of the federal government. And that's hard to believe given the world we live in. But after the Great Depression and the New Deal, many people were now more, at least in touch, and were familiar with the role of the federal government. Okay. So let's start with our first group, and we'll start here with women. The New Deal provided some women with the opportunity to increase their political influence and to promote women's rights. And foremost among them was Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt, as we know, was the wife of Franklin Roosevelt. She was the first lady. And what she's most known for is transforming the role of first lady from one of a more ceremonial position to one of more of an activist, a political activist position. She traveled very widely. She made a lot of stops and campaign visits and stops with her husband, FDR. She visited farms. She visited Indian reservations. She would travel to coal mines to visit labor, coal workers, coal miners. Like I said, she helped campaign for President Roosevelt, and she would even offer him policy advice, and she even wrote her own newspaper column. So she was nicknamed kind of not just First Lady, but she was the First Lady of Main Street. in other words, she occupied a very high social position because of who she was, but she also was in touch with the ordinary person, and she was a very significant figure, not just within the White House, but also among women's groups. And she was also, I should say, going back, she was a very strong advocate for African Americans as well, trying to get Congress and the president to pass off on a federal anti-lynching law, and a proponent of African American civil rights as well. There were other women that also played a very important role in President Roosevelt's administration. The first woman to serve as a cabinet member of any presidential administration was Frances Perkins. She was the labor secretary. She was probably the most famous. And you also had Molly, her name was Molly Dewson. She's not on the slide here, but she was the head of the women's division of the Democratic Party. And she was noted too, a notable figure for recognizing Eleanor Roosevelt and providing women with access to the president. So the New Deal in and of itself, I don't want you to be confused. The New Deal in and of itself did not fight to end gender discrimination in the workplace. So there weren't necessarily laws in place that were part of the New Deal. If you take a look at all of the policies and all of the programs and agencies, you really won't see any there. If you take a look at your New Deal chart, you won't see any there necessarily that attempted to end gender discrimination between men and women. The closest that we would come probably would be like, well, not even the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, because many of these programs made an attempt to hire men first. And there were some programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, where women weren't even allowed to work for those organizations. So as monumental as many of these New Deal programs were, there was still plenty of gender discrimination in the workplace as it existed. All right. So keep that in mind. All right. The New Deal did not end gender discrimination, but Roosevelt was the first president to appoint a female to a cabinet level position, Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. All right, moving on. Next group that was largely affected were African Americans. If you recall, when the Depression hit back in the early 30s, African American workers were often the first ones to lose their jobs. By the mid-1930s, remember I told you the unemployment rate was as high as 25%? That was the overall unemployment rate. But among African American workers, the unemployment rate was almost 50%. 1 out of every 2 African American workers were unemployed. And that was about twice the national average. So going back again to Eleanor Roosevelt, she urged President Roosevelt and Congress to do something about that. So as the New Deal progressed, she used her position as First Lady to stage protests against racial discrimination. And sometimes she was successful, sometimes she was not successful, but she did get her husband, President Roosevelt, to ask advice of members of his black cabinet, like Mary McLeod Bethune. She was a noted member of the black cabinet, and she was the founder of what would come to be known as the Bethune-Cookman College, which of course is still around today. And she was a very powerful champion of not just women's rights, but just racial equality in general. And in her view, the New Deal had created what she calls, quote, a new day for African Americans. She noted that African Americans gained unprecedented access to the White House and positions within the U.S. government during President Roosevelt's administration, during his presidency. Many times Roosevelt listened to the black cabinet, and there were plenty of times when he would not follow the advice of his black cabinet. So bottom line here, we're still talking about the 1930s and 40s. Racial discrimination and injustice continued to plague African Americans. The NAACP, the large civil rights organization that was created in 1919, would launch many campaigns to try and end racial segregation and racial injustice and inequality. They would try to launch campaigns that would support a federal anti-lynching law, but Congress and the president would not support such a law. And the reason that Roosevelt did that is because if he did, quote, it would block the Southern Democrats would block every bill that I would want Congress to pass. So no civil rights legislation reform really came as a part of the New Deal in the 1930s. That's really the important part here. No civil rights legislation was part of the New Deal. Okay. There were several New Deal measures that also unintentionally hurt African Americans. For example, federal payments to farmers to produce fewer crops led to white landowners to evict unneeded black sharecroppers from their farms. And even though they benefited, many of them did, from the WPA and other relief measures, African Americans often did not receive equal wages to that of whites. So there was serious wage discrimination that took place in the workplace. Social Security, for example, and the Fair Labor Standards Act usually exempted domestic workers and farm laborers. And those were occupations, two big occupations in which African Americans were employed in the greatest numbers. Okay, those were domestic workers and farmers. So in other words, they didn't necessarily receive the benefits of Social Security or the Fair Labor Standards Act. Okay, and this is just a slide that kind of helps support what I just said. FDR refused to support that anti-lynching law and some of the other points that I just made. Some of those other New Deal measures that unintentionally hurt African Americans, in other words, these were things that happened that weren't passed on purpose. Like I said, farm subsidies led landowners to evict sharecroppers. African Americans often did not receive equal wages to whites. And like I said, domestic and farm workers really didn't benefit from some of the programs like Social Security because those occupations were exempted from New Deal programs. Okay, another group, so that takes care of two groups of people that were affected, largely women. And then the next group there, of course, were African Americans. A third group that was largely affected by the New Deal were American Indians. And attempting to improve the lives of American Indians, the Roosevelt administration made some major changes to what were long-standing policies. You'll read about in your book the Dawes Act of 1887 that divided tribal lands into smaller plots. But by the 1930s, their condition, American Indians' condition, actually had worsened, and it actually worked against American Indians that it was designed to help. So that needed to change. And to prevent further loss of land and to improve living conditions for American Indians, the Indian New Deal came about, and that was designed by John Collier, who was the New Deal's Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He was appointed by President Roosevelt to basically try and apply the New Deal legislation and programs and whatnot to American Indian groups. And the Indian New Deal essentially can be summed up in those two bullet points there. This was a program that gave American Indians, economic assistance, and it gave them greater control over their own affairs. It would take a lot of funding, but Collier got funding from New Deal agencies that had been created from all these programs, which included construction of new schools. It included construction of new hospitals, and they were created they were part of the Indian Civilian Conservation Corps. Okay, so that was similar to the Civilian Conservation Corps that was created as part of the New Deal. Collier also convinced Congress to pass what was called the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, and this really was considered kind of the masterpiece legislation that would affect the greatest number of American Indians. Okay, and this restored tribal control over their own native land, and that's why it was so important. So control went from essentially white organizations and groups or the government back to native control over their land. So even though the Indian New Deal did not necessarily immediately improve their standard of living, this act, the Indian Reorganization Act, did give American Indians greater control over their own destiny and their lives, and that was important. There were some, though, keep in mind, New Deal measures that actually hurt American Indians. For example, federal authorities determined that, for example, large herds of sheep that were tended by the Navajo were causing soil erosion on the Colorado River. And as a result, the federal government enacted certain laws and legislation that mandated that the Navajo actually kill or sell thousands of their sheep to prevent soil erosion. And the Navajo out west deeply resented this. They did not believe that the sheep threatened the soil, and they did not trust the motives from that point on of the U.S. government and other government agencies. So just to kind of give you an idea, even though there were some things here that were passed and intended, and some did, there were plenty of other acts and legislation and animosity between American Indian groups and the U.S. government. All right. Moving on. The New Deal also created what was known as a new political coalition. Okay, so by the time that Roosevelt had died in 1945, after having been elected for the fourth time, he was known for his legendary political skills. He united really what was unlikely a group of Americans that probably would, prior to the New Deal, probably never would have been part of the same political coalition. And in this case, the word coalition, we're talking about a large group of people that have similar values politically and tend to vote similarly. Okay? And the coalition brought together here were Southern white voters, Northern blue-collar worker voters, farmers in the Midwest, so kind of our part of the country, and also African Americans. Okay? This group of people, this was the core of what was known as the New Deal Coalition. These are the people who tended to vote not just for Roosevelt between the years of 1932 and when he was reelected in 1944 for that fourth time, but this is now forming the core of the Democratic Party, and Democrats were now in the majority. Okay, they all based this on voting patterns. African American voting patterns, for example, showed the importance of the New Deal coalition. Before the New Deal, African Americans tended to vote Republican. Right, they were the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. And African Americans dating all the way back to 1865, roughly 1860, when Lincoln was elected, tended to vote Republican. But by responding to the efforts of the Roosevelts, African Americans began to vote Democrat during the 1930s. And this trend was the strongest in the western part of the country and in the northern part of the country. And the New Deal coalition gave the Democratic Party a sizable majority in both houses of Congress, in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Before FDR's election, the Democrats had been the minority party in the House, and generally going all the way back to 1895. But this completely changed in the 1930s. Okay? The Democrats controlled the House of Representatives between 1932 and 1995 for most of those years, in all but 4 years, actually. That's how big of a deal this coalition was. Okay, the coalition would go on to reelect Roosevelt, of course, in 1936, in 1940, and then again in 1944. Right? So that's one big change. That was one of the major political changes that took place as a result of the New Deal, was this creation of this New Deal coalition and a new group of people that are now voting Democrat. Roosevelt's New Deal programs also helped to try and unify a struggling nation. Okay, this was another effect of the New Deal. Any social and ethnic divisions that existed prior to the New Deal were now largely diminished. I'm not saying they were 100% gone, but they were diminished. Immigrant communities, for example, gained a greater sense of belonging because they started to become part of this New Deal coalition. Immigrants tended to vote Democrat, so you could add them to the list as well. And programs like the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps allowed all different kinds of people with different backgrounds to get to know one another. So it was very inclusive, especially those two New Deal programs. They allowed individuals of various backgrounds to get to not just know one another, but they started to break down they started to break down ethnic prejudices, and this was a positive, one of the positives of the New Deal. So with the New Deal, FDR broke away. This was another major change from the traditional laissez-faire or hands-off approach to government and the economy, and greatly expanded the role of the U.S. government in people's lives, and greatly expanded the role in terms of how the government and to what extent the government gets involved with fixing the economy when something catastrophic like the Great Depression takes place. Okay. I mentioned earlier in the lecture that New Deal programs greatly increased the size and the scope of the federal government. Just pure size, the federal government became so much bigger. And by scope, I mean, the degree that the federal government was now involved in people's lives and involved in fixing the economy was so much greater than it was during Hoover's administration and before. All right. In fact, historian William Lukenberg was quoted as saying, quote, "For the first time for many Americans, the federal government became an institution that was directly experienced. More than the state and local governments, it became the government," end quote. So that sentence right there says it all. Before the New Deal and the Great Depression, the government was state and local. I've kind of alluded to that before. After the New Deal and the Great Depression, the government that people associated with the most was the federal government. Okay? And I said before, too, the New Deal did not end the Depression, but it did help restore the American economy. All right? It was the preparation for World War II that would end the Depression. The New Deal did create a foundation for sustained and stable growth. Okay? It restored confidence and strengthened confidence in capitalism. It encouraged a World War II economic boom during the late 40s and 50s. It restored trust back into banks and the stock market. Millions of more people now were more likely to own their own homes and allowed people to purchase their own homes. Protected workers. Remember, I said the other day in class that Roosevelt was the first president to recognize labor unions and unions' right to strike and collectively bargain. And it helped modernize rural America. Some of the New Deal programs, like the Rural Electrification Association, the REA, helped modernize rural America. So it wasn't just groups of people, but it was also sections and regions of the country that the New Deal helped to strengthen as well. So the New Deal affected millions of different kinds of workers, different kinds of people, and their families. All right? So thousands, for example, of the Public Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration projects benefited communities all around the country, and even local economies. And here on this little map, this is the map that you saw at the beginning of the lecture, there's a map like this similar to your book as well. You notice that whether it was the southwestern part of the country, LA, Arizona, or whether it was the northern part you see in Minnesota, this is where the Civilian Conservation Corps branch in Minnesota was located, up near Bemidji, or it was out east, right? There were many different kinds of projects out east. So every part of the country was affected by the New Deal in some way, specifically the PWA and the WPA, right? Now, one of the other changes and one of the other things that the New Deal did create was something known as the welfare state. Okay? And what Franklin Roosevelt was quoted as saying, and I quote him now, "We are going to make a country in which no one is left out," end quote. And that's what he told Francis Perkins, his labor secretary. The many programs that Roosevelt enacted to realize that goal was known as the rise of the welfare state in the United States. In other words, the term welfare state is used to describe a government that assumes a large responsibility for providing for the welfare of children, the poor, the elderly, the sick, the disabled, and the unemployed. So the creation of the American welfare state was a major league change in government policy. this simply did not exist. The idea of a welfare state prior to the Great Depression and the New Deal simply was not on people's radar. With the exception of military veterans, okay, most Americans had never received any kind of direct benefit from the federal government, ever. And again, that's hard to believe and understand in the world we live in, especially in the United States, but that was true. State and local governments, it was usually private charities, families had long served as the safety net for needy Americans. So in other words, there was no Social Security, right? There was no unemployment insurance. If you lost your job or if you were in dire straits, you could not depend on the federal government because that didn't exist, those kinds of programs. You had to depend on state and local government or charitable organizations to help, or family members, and that was it. There was no safety net. So another way of looking at this, the welfare state, is that the New Deal led to a rise of a social safety net. That's what we're saying here. Okay? The New Deal established the principle that the federal government was responsible for the welfare of all Americans. And in the latter half of the 20th century, the reach of these government programs would only become greater and greater and greater. Now, some would be eliminated, but the size and scope of these programs would become much greater as we turn into the latter half of the 20th century. FDR also favored federal action as part of the New Deal to protect the environment. He was similar to his fifth cousin Teddy Roosevelt that way. Teddy Roosevelt was a huge environmentalist and conservationist, we know. FDR probably wasn't on the same plane as Teddy Roosevelt, but the government did establish 12 million acres of new national parks, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, we know, was environmental in nature. That was basically the point of the CCC, was to restore forests and to preserve the environment. And despite its benefits, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, had some mixed environmental impact. Remember, the TVA was the huge hydroelectric power plant and dam building project in the southeastern part of the United States that to this day still generates a hydroelectric electricity to a huge chunk of the southeastern part of the United States. So that had some mixed reviews in terms of environmental benefits. But there were some environmental benefits as part of the New Deal. And then finally, FDR and the New Deal changed the nature of the presidency itself. Okay? The office of the presidency itself. And probably in no area did FDR have a greater impact than on the office of the president. The government, of course, expanded in power. The creation of many new federal agencies expanded the power of the government and expanded the power of the presidency, and it gave the executive branch much more power. FDR also affected the style of the presidency. Okay, that changed too. I mentioned before he used radio very effectively, right? He was a master at using mass media. And he saw that it was a very essential tool to advertise the New Deal and to communicate with the American citizenry. He expanded the role of the president in terms of managing the economy and how to develop social policy. And because of that, because of his fireside chats, he won not just that second election in 1936, but a third one in 1940, and then a fourth one again in 1944. And because of that, eventually, that would lead to the passage of the 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to serve 2 consecutive terms. Okay? So you can say that it was because of his, popularity and his coalition, right, that kept voting him into office. That caused a major change as well. It caused an amendment that was eventually added to the Constitution. So to sum up here, we've talked about the New Deal and all the programs and all the agencies and all the organizations and whatnot that were created because of the New Deal to help the economy get out of the Depression. But it's just as important to know what the effects of the New Deal were on the economy, on politics, and on society. What groups of people were affected, to what degree they were affected, and then finally here, how the New Deal changed the size and scope of the federal government relative to people's lives, and how FDR himself affected the office of the president. All right, so that's all the notes that we have here for chapter 9.3. Make sure that you read 9.4, which is on the culture of the 1930s. Just make sure you read through that. There will be no separate video lecture for that. All right, that's all I've got for you, sophomores. Take care, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.